direct the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy at American University in Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us today. What we're going to ask you to do is, if you're not speaking today, if you could turn your videos off, please, and leave your microphones on mute. That'll just provide some bandwidth to the speakers. Thanks for joining us for one of our occasional webinars. Today's subject matter is the fires that are currently burning in the Brazilian Amazon. We're joined by three guests who will help us understand the what and the why and the implications of the fires. Before we turn to introductions, I'm going to invite Annalise, who's joining us today, to just give a couple of logistical announcements.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. If you could all please turn off your webcams. I can still see a few of you. We are recording this webinar today, and so it'd be nice if just on the screen were the speakers who were going. So I see about 10 of you maybe on the screen still. So if you could just please make sure that your videos are off. That would make for a very productive webinar. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar, if you could please use the chat function, chat them to everyone so that everyone can see what questions are being asked, and then I will kind of go through those and send them to the moderator so that we can have a more productive webinar. That would be great.
Good. Thank you, Annalise.
Yeah, of course.
Our three speakers today are Angelica Zambrano, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Tourism, Hospitality and Event Management at the University of Florida, where she co-leads the Spatial Ecology and Conservation Lab. Second, we have Matthew Taylor, who's associate professor here in the School of International Service at American University. And our third speaker is Jason Funk, who is principal and founder of the Land Use and Climate Knowledge Initiative, which is a project of the Global Philanthropy Partnership. Angelica, can we begin with you? Can you tell us what's going on in the Amazon?
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, joining from Gainesville, Florida, where the hurricane just spurred us. So to try to address your question the best possible, there's a lot of fire going on. There is different reasons why this may be happening this year. So we have a year that may be particularly dry, as well with a year that has administration has relaxed environmental regulations. And we have a lot of people that rely on fire to be able to make a living from year to year. So this has led to a number of fires in the Amazon. I would like to share a map that will give us some idea of what it looks like, where are these fires taking place. And just 1 second here. So I hope you can all see my screen. It zooms into their land, and so they're able to continue doing their subsistence cropping. We also have a lot of cattle ranching that relies on pastures, right? The way that pastures are managed in the Amazon, for the most part, is that they burn every year. So you burn your pasture, and then you expect, those seeds that have been exposed to fire to germinate really strong, and then so that's how it's managed. There's a number of programs from the government, mainly from Embrapa, that have tried to implement different ways of managing pastures. However, they have not been successful. They haven't been, they're successful while they are in experimental fields, but they haven't been able to convince people to use them. So most cattle ranchers or anybody that has a pasture, no matter what size it is, will burn their pasture to be able to start a new year with a good, strong new pasture, right? And then lastly, we have industrial agriculture, where we have these vast, large areas of land of forests that are being cleared for industrial agriculture, and they rely on the same methods as with the small farmers. They have to fall the trees and then they burn them, right? And so what happens in a very dry year like this year is that the fires can escape very easily from all those three sources. There's also the possibility that some of the fires may have been set in purpose, of course, and you are going to see that a lot of the imagery for these areas is going to show areas of agriculture where it's most likely that the fire escaped. But there's also going to be some images where you're going to find that the fire is actually in the middle of the forest, where they are likely to have been set there on purpose. So that's what's going on right now in the Amazon.
And Angelica, thank you. Matt, can I turn to you for a sense of some of the dynamics, the history of some of the dynamics that Angelica is talking about with us, and then some of the domestic and current politics around this stuff? We have to take you off mute, Matt.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me now. Thanks for the invitation. Good afternoon, good morning to those of you on the East Coast or in the Northeast. I think that the politics of this are somewhat crazy for those of us who are in the United States or outside of Brazil. You may have seen that there was a bit of a banter between Macron and Bolsonaro over the fires, in which Macron criticized inaction by Brazil. Bolsonaro responded by calling Macron an opportunist and then insulted Macron's wife. For good measure, his son tweeted a video called "Macron is an Idiot." Bolsonaro then went and rejected $20 million in aid that the G7 had suggested or had decided to offer to Brazil. And so there was a real, I think, sort of a war of words there. At the same time, Bolsonaro, though, did respond to the pressure to some degree. He placed a ban, the federal government in Brazil placed a ban on setting fires, and then Bolsonaro also convened a summit of the Amazon countries. To kind of understand the dynamics here, though, I think it's useful just to think about Brazilian history. I won't go deep into Brazilian history, except to say that insecurity about the Amazon is very deep-rooted and goes back a long way. At the turn of the 19th century, there was the so-called lieutenants movement, and one of the rationales of the lieutenants movement was basically that Brazil didn't know its own riches. It didn't know its interior. It didn't understand its interior, and it was important to open it up. Prior to World War I, Marshal Rondon, a Brazilian explorer, took Teddy Roosevelt, who had just stepped down from the presidency in the United States, and they went on a discovery mission into the interior of the Amazon, where they found the River of Doubt and renamed it in Roosevelt's honor the River Teodoro. But I think most important here is to point out that from a military perspective, from a national strategy and strategic perspective, Brazil has long been very insecure about not knowing enough about the Amazon and not doing enough to exploit it. There was in the 1930s a military strategist who argued that we need to integrate so as not to hand over the Amazon. We need to integrate the Amazon so as not to hand it over. Integrar para no entregar, as they say in Portuguese. And this was taken up, this notion of preserving the Amazon and integrating it and developing it was taken up by the military regime, which followed a very developmentalist economic policy. They were responsible for a number of major infrastructure projects into the Amazon, including most notably the Trans-Amazon Highway. They also implemented a thing called the Manaus Free Trade Zone, and both of these, I think, are essential to understanding the way in which the Amazon is viewed by a particular sector of the military and the national security establishment in Brazil. Of course, these development objectives, whether they're driven by economic development or national security concerns, have led to the degradation of Amazon ecosystems. This is something that took place under the military regime from 1964 to 1985, but then has continued even under the democratic governments of the past generation. Most recently, President Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, and prior to her, President Lula of the Workers' Party, despite championing many aspects of environmental protection, carried on some very major infrastructure projects, including the Belo Monte Dam project, which is an $18 billion, at last count, it may be larger now, hydroelectric dam on the Xingu River. This has had just enormous environmental consequences. Every time you open up a road or a project into the Amazon, it of course expands beyond its initial path. And so the Belo Monte Dam was one of these projects. Another project is a major highway that is 2,000 kilometers long between the states of Mato Grosso and Pará, also undertaken by the Rousseff government. So I guess the question here is sort of what is driving this, and how do Brazilians view the Amazon? Of course, nobody likes to be lectured by rich countries about what they should do with their natural resources. There is this fear of foreign intervention that I've already pointed out, this idea that you must integrate so as not to hand over the Amazon. And in a recent poll done by Datafolha, which is a major Brazilian polling company, about 42% of Brazilians agreed with the statement that other countries' interests in the Amazon are only an excuse to gain power and control over the Amazon. So a very significant plurality of Brazilians. I think that exacerbating this tendency right now is the fact that Bolsonaro is a former army officer. He was trained in the national security doctrine. He's a very fond advocate of the military regime and its authoritarian legacy. And so his immediate response to criticism of the fires was to blame NGOs, to cast this as fake news, and even to pass around conspiracy theories about this being a conspiracy by rich nations to seize this land. So that's kind of the immediate issue. I'll just point quickly before I pass it along to what I see as 7 sort of longer-term drivers that are essential to understanding these fires. And I agree with Angelica on all of the motivations for using pasture land and farmland and major agricultural crops. But I think we should also consider the fact that there are these other drivers of deforestation in the Amazon that have long been present. So the first is simply the last 20 years expansion of Brazil's commodity exports. And so this kind of goes hand in hand with what Angelica mentioned, but certainly the expansion of soy exports and also of beef exports has been a major driver here of demand for land. Secondly, beginning with the military regime and continuing through the present day, the economic policy infrastructure in Brazil is such that there's a lot of support to major agro producers. So, for example, one of the major beneficiaries of loans from the National Development Bank in Brazil under the Workers' Party was JBS. And JBS is sometimes known by the name of its umbrella company, J&F. But JBS, you will probably recognize as the owner of Pilgrim's, Pride, Swift, and a number of other meatpacking interests. And it's Brazil's largest meatpacking firm and a real giant. But there's continued support by institutions of the developmental state in Brazil for these agro interests. Third is the dilution of the so-called Forestry Code, and this is the law that governs the use of the forests, but also agricultural land in Brazil. This code was rewritten under the Workers' Party, and part of rewriting it was to actually dilute it and to pardon past deforestation. And so this sets up a really perverse incentive in terms of enforcement. Especially under Bolsonaro, fourth, there's been an enormous weakening of environmental agencies. So Bolsonaro recently fired the head of the Space Institute, INPE. INPE is the body that basically surveys the Amazon. He has downgraded the capacity of IBAMA, which is the environmental agency, and he's been reluctant to devote resources to the police in this region. Fifth, there's been an ongoing political crisis since 2013 in Brazil. It started with mass demonstrations, it turned into impeachment, it's tied up in the corruption scandal, and I think the overall effect for the Amazon has been negligence at best, and sort of turning a blind eye to what's going on there. There's not a lot of leadership, and there hasn't been a lot of leadership from the top. Sixth, the recession that's been going in tandem with the political crisis for most of the past half decade is tied up in the poverty of the Amazon region. So if you look at the Amazon is, as you all know, is quite large. It's also quite poor. And about half of the population of the Amazon is about 25 million. About half of that population is below the poverty level. So you can see that might contribute to some of the problems that Angelica pointed to with small farmers and deforestation by that particular group. And then finally, seventh, the sort of longer term problem that I think is recurring every time that Brazil goes through one of these recurring crises of deforestation is the weakness of the rule of law. And for those of you who are interested in reading more about this, there are two phenomenal books on sort of the rule of law and environmental politics in Brazil that really point to the problems of land title, the problems of judicial enforcement of land ownership, the problems of illegality and the use of force in the countryside. And the two books, there are many books that you can possibly read, but the first is actually about a very major failure of Brazilian environmental policy that predates much of what we're discussing in the Amazon, and that is the destruction of the Atlantic rainforest in the south and southeast of Brazil. And this is a book by Warren Dean called With Broad Axe and Firebrand. The second book is more recent, and I think addresses much of what's been happening in the Amazon region, and that's James Holston's work on, I just happen to have it here with me, Insurgent Citizenship, in which he discusses the patterns of illegality and inequality as norms in this region. And of particular importance here is this issue of land title. One of the ways that land has been passed along has been through intentional starting of fires by so-called grileiros. Grilo in Portuguese is a grasshopper or a cricket. And so you can imagine these crickets coming in and eating up the forest. And then once it's been cleared, the land is sold, sometimes with fake title, illegal titles. Sometimes those titles are acquired through violence. But the central problem here is that the judiciary in Brazil is so weak and so delay-ridden that it becomes very hard to resolve these issues of land title in an efficient manner. And so the incentives that this creates for clear-cutting the land and passing it along, I think, are quite perverse. And over the long term, I'm not suggesting that they explain everything in the current crisis, but over the long term, this contributes to the steady advance on the Amazon that we've seen over this past winter in Brazil. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Matt, thank you. Angelica, before we turn to Jason, I wonder if you have any reactions or responses to what you heard from Matt?
Yes, yeah, Matt is actually quite right. I think he did a really good summary of the events that have led to where we are right now, and the potential contributions. We tend to think about what is going on in the Amazon and the drivers of deforestation as proximate drivers and underlying drivers. So the proximate drivers are the actual actions that lead to deforestation, right? Like what I mentioned. Cropping, whether it's industrial or just subsistence, pasturing, whatever actually leads to clearing land is what we call proximate. And then when we talk about the underlying are all the other factors that Matt has outlined clearly, like all the political instability that may lead to people back to the forest, for example, which is all the economic troubles that Brazil has seen over the last couple of years also may lead people back to the forest. And then there is the major problem of the land tenure system. If you don't have a solid land tenure system, there's no way to actually enforce the rules, right? So even when you just talk about the most basic forest code rule, which is 80-20. So anybody who has land within the legal Amazon in Brazil should leave 80% of their land on forest, and is only allowed to deforest 20. However, if you're not able to say what land belongs to whom, then there's no way to actually be able to enforce the 80-20. So there's a lot of challenges to be able to actually enforce the rules, even the most basic ones. And as Matt mentioned, even now we have less interest on enforcing. INPE was equivalent to, I would say to a certain extent, to NASA, and was able to do all the satellite imagery analysis to be able to determine how much has been deforested on the Amazon every year. And as Matt mentioned, they're not able to do that anymore on an efficient and reliable way. So yes, I think that's all I have to add, and thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Jason, can we bring you in? What's the climate connection here?
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to Matt and Helika for those great comments, which really helped to shed light on these issues. I want to draw this connection a little bit to the climate situation and how these fires in the Amazon and the Amazon forest itself play a role in the climate system. So let's step back a bit just to give some of that context and background. Forests play a really key role in the Earth's climate system. They are the largest contributor to the terrestrial sink that we enjoy, which absorbs about 25% of our annual emissions of greenhouse gases. And the Amazon is one of these large forest basins, one of about 5 large forest areas in the world that's playing that role. The Amazon is perhaps unique in that its configuration within South America and its orientation geographically means that it also plays a key role in the Earth's water cycle. So I'll talk a little bit about more about how those two things are linked in a few minutes. When we're talking about the Amazon forest and forests generally, for a long time the conventional wisdom was just that once forests reached a certain age or maturity level, they were just filled up with carbon. You couldn't put any more in. They were in equilibrium with the atmosphere, that they were absorbing just as much carbon as they were emitting as dead material was decaying. There's been recent science, though, in the past few years that's really debunked that idea, and they've debunked it for tropical forests globally. They've been able to show, using permanent plots that are resampled over time, that those forests continue to accumulate carbon. What's driving the emissions from tropical forests primarily is human activities. That's the only reason why tropical forests are still emitting a lot of carbon. Otherwise, they would be sequestering a vast amount of carbon, and they would continue to do so even in mature areas of forest. So that's a little bit of change to the conventional wisdom about these tropical forests. And then there's some complicated reasons for why that continues to happen and why that conventional wisdom is wrong. Let's talk a little bit, though, about the role of fires in forest ecosystems in particular, and understand how that relates to these Amazon systems. In many places, many types of forests, they're actually dependent on fire to regenerate themselves, to allow seeds to sprout. And we see characteristics of those types of forests, for example, in the western U.S., where those forests really need fire to be present in order to regenerate themselves. But what we don't see in the Amazon is that those same characteristics aren't part of that forest. The Amazon forest ecosystem is not dependent on fire. And we can look back at the paleoecological record and see that fire hasn't had a large presence in the Amazon ever. It's a really rare occurrence to have widespread fires of the type we're seeing now. In recent decades, we've seen some more of that, and that's related to the factors that we've already been talking about and heard from Angelica and Matt, that there's a climate effect, which is sort of an underlying driver. We've seen drier conditions in the Amazon in recent years where there have been unusual levels of drought. That seems to be the case this year as well. And then we've also seen a proximate effect from human activities that are igniting more fires, and then those fires can become more widespread because of the drought conditions. Because the Amazon has not been adapted to that type of fire, we can say that this system is vulnerable. These types of activities actually could undermine the ecological functions that allow the Amazon to be self-sustaining. And that's possibly approaching a critical tipping point. Several years ago, a group of scientists, including some American and Brazilian scientists, did some climate modeling where they estimated what would that tipping point be? At what point of loss of tree cover could the Amazon no longer be self-sustaining? And they've estimated a range between 20 and 25% forest cover loss would mean that the Amazon system was no longer able to keep sustaining itself. And the latest estimates from the Brazilian government are that we're beyond 19% forest cover loss in the Amazon. So we're getting very close to that tipping point. And if these types of fires and other land use changes keep going, we may cross that threshold where the Amazon forest ecosystem is no longer able to sustain itself. It would transition into something that looks more like a savanna woodland ecosystem. And concurrent with that, we would see a huge loss of not only the carbon in the ecosystem, but also much of the biodiversity that's supported there, which is critical to its function. So we're in sort of a precarious situation. There are some reasons related to the way the Amazon works uniquely within the water cycle. That continuous canopy of forest cover pumps water into the atmosphere on an ongoing basis. So all the water that's falling into the Amazon basin gets taken up by these plants, re-emitted through a process called transpiration back into the atmosphere. And so whatever falls in the Amazon basin gets recycled a number of times. And that helps to ensure that that water keeps being reused and is available to that forest ecosystem for a long period of time. Eventually, that water moves its way through atmospheric channels into other parts of the world where it happens to be pretty important for the productivity of the agricultural systems here in the Midwest, where I'm based near Chicago. So this actually has a global significance to the role that this forest plays in the water cycle. And if we lose that, we've crossed that threshold and that tipping point, then we could actually see cascading impacts all around the world. I just want to point out a couple recent things that just came out on Friday, which help to give you a sense of the scale or where we are on this issue. The Woods Hole Research Center and partnered up with a group called EPAM in Brazil to estimate the emissions so far from the Brazilian fires this year. And they estimated that between 104 to 141 million metric tons of carbon dioxide from the fires, which they say is equivalent to about the annual emissions from the state of North Carolina. So it's quite significant in scale just from these fires alone. We're seeing these emissions occurring, which are contributing to the climate problem. A second thing to take a look at is an article that came out in the New York Times on Friday about this issue. The title is "It's Really Close: How the Amazon Rainforest Could Self-Destruct." And that's where you'll find a lot of more detailed information about this tipping point and the current status of the fires, which is quite interesting. The only thing that I have issue about with that article is the title or the subtitle. The Amazon rainforest is not self-destructing. I think that's a bit misleading in the sense that it takes away this idea that there's human agency involved here. It makes it seem like it's just happening on its own. In fact, as Angelica and Matt have pointed out, what we're seeing is the result of a long-term and short-term set of human activities and processes that are causing this problem. So the idea that the Amazon is self-destructing is sort of like saying Julius Caesar self-destructed after he had a lot of holes poked into him by his friends. That just doesn't make any sense. But otherwise, I think the article has a lot of good information, and it's really key to understand these complex dynamics, which have both climate factors related to them and these sort of proximate activities happening on the ground. So thanks, Simon. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Jason, thanks. And thanks to Angelica and Matt for setting the table for us. We have about 25 minutes left. So if folks have questions, please feel free to chat those questions using the chat box. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. As we're waiting for questions to start coming in, I wonder what can be done. Are there policy interventions? Are there other sorts of interventions which any of you can imagine right now that would start to alleviate what we're seeing in the Amazon?
If nobody would like to answer, I can give it a shot.
Matt, thank you.
So let me preface it by saying I'm not an expert in the environmental side, and so these are the musings of a political scientist. But I think that it is probably important to think about. It's not exactly successes, but the fact that there has been some improvement, or there had been some improvement in Brazil over the 20 years. Roughly from 1994 to maybe 2014. And part of that was because of government action, including changes in the enforcement regime and sort of making it harder for people, for example, to get loans from the National Development Bank if they were known to be abusing the rules on deforestation. In the shorter term, I also think that the recession has put a bit of a squeeze on some of the larger and more messianic development projects, and so that's in some sense a bit of a relief. And there are no Belo Monte projects, for example, on the table right now. And then it's also important to look domestically. Polls are showing that Brazilians are a slight majority of Brazilians, a very slight majority, about 51%, are unlikely to support Bolsonaro on his approach to the Amazon. And this is partly because there's, I think, increasing evidence of impacts in the wealthy south and southeastern regions of Brazil. Recently, Sao Paulo was cloaked in smog from fires, not exactly the fires in the Amazon, but from fires. There is certainly a long-term trend of warming temperatures in Sao Paulo and even of drought. And then finally, I think that it's really important to keep up international pressure, whether it's through corporations. Last week, Timberland decided it would stop purchasing Brazilian leather, and I don't know if that will have much effect, but I think it's not a bad start. There have been efforts in the past to try to differentiate soy that is grown on deforested land from soy grown elsewhere. Right now, the EU has a lot of leverage over Brazil because Brazil is part of the Mercosur trade bloc, and they've just negotiated an agreement with the EU, and the EU is perhaps more reluctant than they would have been a month ago to ratify that agreement. So I think that there's some evidence that these pressures are are changing Bolsonaro's mind on what he needs to do. He is still reluctant to do a great deal, but he has imposed a ban on further fires. Not that it hasn't been very effective, but he has imposed a ban. And he also has sent a small military force to work towards blocking these fires. So, I think that those kind of pressures are effective. For those who might be interested, Bolsonaro will be at the UN General Assembly in New York later this month. And that might be another leverage point, pressure point for drawing attention to some of the concerns.
Angelica or Jason, anything on the policy front, anything that can be done right now to start to address the fires? And then we have a number of other questions that I'll start posing to you.
I'm just going to add quickly to what Matt already said. I believe that a sound land tenure system is going to be necessary for any long-term sustainability of the rule of law, to be able to enforce the 80-20, or to be able to enforce penalties on whoever is setting fire, whether it is on purpose or is escaping. So I think if we don't have those clear land tenure rules in place, if we don't know what belongs to who and who is burning what, and we're not going to be able to enforce many rules. So that will be on top of the things that Matt already mentioned, such as putting pressure on the commodities. I think that is really important.
Thanks. Jason?
I think I could talk a little bit about international incentives that could be available to Brazil through the mechanism called REDD+, but I see that that's popped up in the chat box as a question, so I think I'll just hold off on that. But I think, Matt talked a little bit about the sticks that can come through international pressure, and I can talk a little bit about the carrot that's also available.
Yeah, if you can jump in there now, Jason, that would be fabulous.
Okay, so the international approach that's policy approach is convened through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a process established in 1992, and lots of countries, including Brazil, signed onto that convention. The most recent agreement that's been built under that convention is the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015. And under that agreement, part of it was affirming the development of this approach called REDD+, which stands for reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, and several other activities. That's what the plus captures. This mechanism allows mostly rich donor countries to provide incentives to countries that have a lot of tropical forests, developing countries, to give them incentives to stop that activity and sort of channel their economic development into new pathways. And in Brazil has been by far the largest recipient of those incentives, including sort of $1 billion that's been put on the table by Norway in order to provide an economic incentive to build a development pathway that's in a different direction, that doesn't depend on deforestation. The thinking behind this is the same way that we have talked about the decarbonization of the fossil fuel parts of our economy. This is telling developing countries there's another way you can disconnect your economic development from these activities that create a lot of emissions. But for them, it has more to do with deforestation rather than fossil fuel use. So that's what the incentive is designed to address. And it's fairly significant. And until the Bolsonaro administration, Brazil had seemed to be pretty open to those kinds of changes. It's likely that a more extractive type of approach to development would have generated more revenue than that $1 billion. But the point was to shift onto a different course, and that seems like it was having a very good effect. With the changes that the Bolsonaro administration has made, though, it seems like they're completely rejecting that, shifting into a different direction, and it's unclear whether that REDD+ mechanism will still be successful for Brazil. Other countries, however, are more than willing to jump into the breach and make good use of those incentives, and are already working toward, thinking about development pathways that don't involve deforestation.
Thanks, Jason. While you have the microphone, a couple of other questions that you might be able to help us with. One was about the tipping point that you referenced. This idea that if the Amazon were to lose 20 to 25% of its forest cover, then it might tip over into a new state.
Mm-hmm.
Question about how certain we are of that, and whether there are references you can point to.
I think there's quite a bit of uncertainty around that number, and this is So this is an unprecedented situation in human history. We don't know, we haven't been down this path before. So the best tool that we have to interrogate that is using integrated climate and land use models. And those models always have a degree of uncertainty related to them, especially when we get outside of the range that we've seen historically. So we are extrapolating and we're relying on our understanding of the function of these different ecosystems and how they relate to these carbon and water cycles. But that science has been done for a while now, and it's been tested by other scientists using different kinds of models. This is covered in the article from the New York Times on Friday, who was doing that original modeling work, and they sort of admit, like, yes, this was a scientific, educated guess, but we've used more sophisticated approaches over time, and I don't think that threshold has been debunked. But I would acknowledge that there is quite a bit of uncertainty around it. I think there's the second question was about what would this transformation look like, or this transition. This is also an area that is unprecedented, and we don't have a great understanding of the kinds of ecological cascades that would occur through that transition. But we do expect that the sorts of food webs that hold that system together would break down, and that would mean a lot of species would lose these vital connections that they have within the ecosystem and then would not be able to survive. So we could go through a long-term, this transition could take centuries, in fact, to see it fully reestablish a new stable ecosystem, which would look much different than the system we have now. And right now, we are on that path, and we don't have any plan for how we're going to get off that path and prevent that outcome from happening, even though it may take generations for it to fully unfold. Along with that would come the loss of a lot of that carbon in the Amazon ecosystem, and that could be something that's quite shocking to observe. It could involve massive widespread fires, it could involve droughts, it could involve the death of lots of wildlife that are there now, and obviously that would have huge consequences for the human populations that are also dependent on these ecosystems right now.
Jason, thanks. Angelica and then Matt, I wonder if you can give us any stronger sense of the current Brazilian domestic conversation, whether there's any pushback against what is coming out of the current administration, and what the other constituencies are, including from the questions here, the indigenous populations and indigenous voice inside Brazil. Who is saying what inside Brazil about these fires?
I'll take a first step. Would that be okay, Matt? So it seems to me that usually it's been the indigenous populations have complained on the national government and the state governments for different things. This is the same with the fires, right? So I would like to say that the spatial distribution of the fires includes very few indigenous areas as compared to where the intensity of the fires is taking place, which is in agricultural lands for the most part. However, they are being affected. Most of them seem to be fires are escaping from the agricultural frontier into protected areas and into indigenous areas. There's a few cases where the fires seem to have been originated well within the indigenous lands. So in general, I would say that indigenous groups are demanding the government to enforce more control over the fires, over when should be allowed to set fires, if ever, right? And who should be alerted to when is there going to be a fire going on in my neighbor's land, for example. So that is going on. There's a lot of protests and there's a lot of discontent among the indigenous groups regarding the fires. I would say from the scientific community, there's a lot of discontent on the response from the government towards the fires, right? And I think that's that could be extended to perhaps the 51% that Matt mentioned, the 51% general population that is not very supportive of Bolsonaro's management of the fire, right, within Brazil. That being said, I don't know that there is any action taken, against the administration, or I think that would be the limits of my understanding at this point.
Thanks, Angelica. Matt?
Yeah, I agree with everything Angelica said. I think I don't know if it's hopeful or not, but Brazil's political system at the federal level is very fragmented. There are about 30 political parties currently represented in Congress, and Bolsonaro has to govern with some portion of those parties. In recent history, one of the strongest interest groups in Brazil has been the so-called Rural Caucus, and this is members of various parties, but all of whom are landowners and interested in agricultural production. And in the past, that group has, I think, been very eager to see agricultural production expand, no matter the environmental cost. And they were certainly influential in the watering down of the Forestry Code. I guess where there has been some hopeful movement, it's still very preliminary, but many of the members, the most prominent members of the Rural Caucus, have actually been encouraging a more robust government response. And I think that's partly because of international pressure. It's, certainly the threat or the possibility of a boycott of Brazilian agricultural goods changes the calculus significantly. That's not to say that those folks have changed their tune entirely, but I do think that they have been pushing Bolsonaro in a direction that he might not otherwise have gone. And the fact that he has, shown any willingness to engage on this at all, it reflects the fact that he has allies within Congress who are pushing him to do so. Just one more thing that Angelica didn't mention that I think is worth bringing into the discussion is the fact that Brazil has a federal system. I guess Angelica was kind of alluding to this, but just to highlight it a little bit more, under the federal system, there are 7 different governments who are essentially engaged in fighting these fires, plus a bunch of municipal authorities. So you have the federal government, and then you have the state governments, and then you have literally hundreds of municipalities. And not all of those governments share the same perspective. And so from a policy point of view, this is quite complicated. It's hard to come up with a unified response. While the federal government can lead to some extent, in some areas such as law enforcement, it's really the states that are more powerful. And so sending in the military helps to oversee and to make sure that there's some oversight of what's going on, but they don't have the kind of enforcement powers that the state police would have. So this is really quite complex, and I don't mean to suggest that nothing can be done, but I think we need to be realistic about the ability of the Bolsonaro government at the federal level to really play as significant a role. That does point, though, to the idea that maybe one way to change the trajectory here is to offer more direct support to state and local governments and to state and local organizations, as I think Angelica and Jason had pointed out. So, thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Can we stay with you for just a little bit more on the international context here? So you're mentioning a few different things that actors outside Brazil could perhaps do to offer support or to alleviate the fires. There are also a bunch of questions in the chat box there about who is responsible for the fires. If we think about the fact that there's a lot of demand for Brazilian products in, say, China, the United States, Western Europe, how do we kind of unpack that dimension of this? Who should bear responsibility for what's happening in Brazil?
Right. I mean, I think everybody, consumers, of course, have an important role to play. I think pressure that we can put on these industries, whether it's by reducing our own consumption of meat or other agricultural products that are quite intensive in land use, that can be very significant. I guess I'm of two minds, though, on the trade side of this. I think that what we've seen here is that trade can be an effective way to impose some accountability on Brazilian producers. So I'm not a fan of isolationism or reducing trade deals. I saw one of the questions was sort of, should the EU perhaps pull back on Mercosur? I don't think they should pull back. That doesn't mean that they can't. The EU couldn't demand, a greater environmental content to that trade deal. So I think that we have to be cautious about using trade. Trade is an important lever, but if we withdraw completely from trading with Brazil, I think that an enormous amount of leverage is lost. And there are at least hopeful signs that some of the larger agricultural producers recognize that if they aren't able to change their reputation for the agricultural practices that they use, they may face an enormous backlash among Western consumers, and especially consumers in the global North.
Angelica or Jason, anything else to add on those points?
I'd just like to quickly add that the internal market within Brazil is also quite large. So even if you are able to get a handle on the commodities, which are of course very important, and when it comes to industrial agriculture, internal consumption is quite important, and it drives the deforestation at the smaller scales. So timber, meat, and agricultural products, but mostly timber and meat are really important products that are consumed internally within Brazil, within the Amazon. It used to be the case that it would go to other states in the south, but now the rich states in the south mostly export towards the EU and the US. So now a lot of what is produced in the Amazon is actually consumed within Brazil, if not exported.
Jason, with just a few minutes left, I want to ask you a question that's been vexing me. So with the Amazon, what role is there really for forests in international climate response? Right? How can we be sure that carbon that goes into forests can, in the long term, stay there?
That's a great question. Maybe it's worth putting a little bit of this into perspective. I think the fires that we see in the Amazon right now, and the wildfires we've seen in various places around the world in recent years, they seem dramatic, they seem catastrophic. And certainly in a localized way, they have a devastating impact. But overall, forests globally are so vast that forests are actually a pretty safe place to park carbon for a while if you need it to be out of the atmosphere. And when we look globally at the scale of loss and the emissions coming from forests, it's still not overcoming this terrestrial sink that we enjoy that's absorbing all this carbon from the atmosphere. Now, we could do a lot to slow down the loss of those forests and the degradation of those forests, and that's probably the first step we should take. That's a triage style approach. First, stop doing harm, right? We could also do a great deal to recover areas of forest that have been lost, begin reforestation and restoration of degraded forests. There's quite a bit that can be done here in the US even, where we know that lots of forests are understocked for various reasons and could be restored. And I think we have to do that in a way that kind of continues to ensure that there's a role economically in sustaining those forests as something that provides materials and things to our economy, but that needs to be done in a sustainable way. That's key for a future climate to be sustainable as well, is that we need to begin to make sure our forests are managed sustainably. And there are lots of places in the world where that's not occurring, and lots of people, including me, are very upset about that and are pointing out those places so that we can intervene with policy measures and other measures to make sure that that doesn't keep happening. Part of that has to involve, part of our climate response, though, it's become more clear from recent IPCC reports that one of the things we need to do is substantially increase the area of forest globally. We've seen the loss of about 2 billion hectares of forest since pre-industrial times, and now we're down to about 4 billion hectares of forest in the world. If we recovered something between 400 to 800 million hectares of what has been lost, that would allow the Earth's terrestrial system to provide a great deal of carbon sequestration that's going to be needed to keep us on a safe climate trajectory, consistent with a 1.5 to 2 degree pathway. So that's something that I think is has everything to do with carbon removal and the issue of carbon removal and how would we accomplish it and at what scale and what role do forests play in that. What we don't have right now are some clear ways that we can incentivize that kind of forest restoration, both economically and in terms of policy. So I think that that's the next stage of work is to try to figure those things out.
Jason, thanks. We have about 30 seconds each for each of you to say a few final words.
Well, I just want to thank you for organizing. Thank you for all the participants and the great questions. It's been my pleasure to be here with you. And I'm just looking forward if there's anything else on the fires.
Thank you, Angelica.
Likewise, thank you, Simon, for organizing us, and to my co-panelists here. I learned a lot from both of you. I guess the lesson I take away is we need to continue to keep an eye on the Amazon and think about ways that don't that are helpful to Brazilians without pushing their concerns about national sovereignty.
Yeah, I think I would just pick up that theme. The limited amount of time I spent in Brazil and in the Amazon area, it's clear that the people who live there are just trying to make a living, trying to do what they can to support their own families and their own livelihoods. And the ways that we can intervene in this problem, which is a global problem, we need to make sure that it's not that they're not bearing the burden of those changes more than they need to. We need to offer them different pathways to achieve those same livelihood goals, just like we all want to achieve here at home. So I think it's important to have that in mind as we pursue any policy interventions or think about how these issues of trade deals and other things could bring pressure to bear on Brazil. And I also want to thank all of you and all the listeners for participating in this webinar.
Jason and Matt and Angelica, thank you all for joining us today. This webinar has been hosted by the Institute for Carbon Removal, Law and Policy at American University. Our web address is in the chat box there, american.edu/sis/carbon removal. Some of you have been asking whether the webinar will be available to share. We'll put it up within the next 2 weeks, captioned so that you can share it around. Annalise, thanks for everything you've done to organize today, and join us for the next one. Thank you all.